Hi, and welcome to The Missing Middle. I'm Cara Stern, and Mike's not here today, but I'm joined by another person you probably recognize from Twitter if you're into housing topics. This is Shaista, and we're very happy she's here with us today. And you might recognize her better from her Twitter name, Justice Queen, with the handle RE Market Watch. So thank you so much for joining us, Shaista.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
She asked us not to use her surname, but she's a longtime Toronto and 905 real estate observer, and she provides really wonderful insights on everything from the state of the Ontario tribunal system to the plight of international students. And so we're really happy you could join us. So let's start off. How did you get interested in Toronto real estate? Because you're not from Toronto, right? You're from Edmonton?
Yeah, that's right. So I was actually born and raised in Edmonton, and I grew up there for pretty much almost my whole life. Then I moved to Calgary for a number of years, and then I actually went to school in Toronto. So I came here to actually do my MSW, so Masters of Social Work. So I ended up in Toronto, and I mean, I was not really into real estate for a long time because I rented when I came here, and then I rented in downtown, and then I kind of sort of accidentally got into real estate in terms of my condo that I bought. I actually ended up being in this purpose-built rental, which was a beautiful building, a really old building in Toronto. But all of a sudden it had a cockroach infestation. And I have to be almost thankful that happened, because that's the only thing that pushed me to get into the condo market, which is absolutely crazy. But it just made me realize a lot about almost having your future or your life set in the hands of someone else, where you can't just call a company and get it fixed. You have to go through the property management, you have to figure it out, and it could go on for months. And it was something that just really affected me. And then I was like, you know what, I'm just going to buy my own place so that I can have control over my property, and if anything were to happen, at least I could fix it, because it just kept going on for months. And I think a lot of tenants have these issues, right, where they're in certain buildings and there's things that are happening. So that's actually how I ended up getting into real estate.
And then what did it cost you to buy back then?
So back then, so it would have been over 10 years ago, and I have a condo on Queen Street, and it actually costed me $280,000 at that time. And that today, wouldn't be possible, right? So it's just interesting to see how even over the span of 10 years, how much has changed. And I always tell people, if I didn't have that infestation, I honestly think I would have still rented, because I had zero interest in getting into the market. It never crossed my mind. I honestly never thought of it. I was perfectly happy. I liked my little, purpose-built rental bachelor studio. I actually enjoyed it. And I guess I was just so busy with my career, so busy working. And I was I don't know, maybe I would go back to Alberta one day. It just never crossed my mind. But it was probably one of the best decisions, financial decisions, I would say, that I made, in my life. And it completely happened out of nowhere, and only because I had that infestation that I packed up all my stuff in boxes and I was I'm out of here. I cannot be in this place.
I think about how that kind of thing couldn't happen now, right? Someone who is stuck with a infestation, chances are they can't afford to move on their own, especially if it's, I don't know if were you living alone at the time?
I was living alone, yeah. And it was very affordable rent, I would say. So I looked up that building recently because I was I wonder what they go for now. And back then, and that would have been about a little bit over 10 years ago, I was renting that place for $1,100, and it was in Yorkville. And now that same place, which was a studio, and it's still an old building, but it's a really nice building, it's an old purpose-built rental, very well built. I mean, now it's it's about $2,100, I believe, for that studio. And they've kind of renovated the units and kind of made them look nicer, but still it's double the price. And you're right. If someone had that problem today, they wouldn't have the luxury of really saying, oh, well, I'll go look. And it was for me, that was just I just called, and I was also able to, I guess the condo market might have been a little bit down at that point too, because it wasn't a rush. There was no bidding wars. There was no competition. It's I could just kind of look around, go from condo to condo and make a decision. I mean, I did make my decision.
Well, that's the dream, man. That's amazing.
Yeah. Totally. And I think of it today, and I even think of friends who have bought like in recent years. And I remember I had known someone before the pandemic that was looking, and it was like they couldn't even look at the properties, like because condos were booming before the pandemic, right? In early 2020, late 2019, it was like sometimes they just have offer nights like at the realtor's office where people would go and like fill in their forms or whatever and put in whatever their bid was. And people couldn't even necessarily see the properties.
That's so wild because you think about this is like the biggest financial decision someone can make is putting, getting into that level of debt. And to think that they have to do it totally blind is just like, that's terrifying, eh?
Oh, totally. And it's just like, even when you think of like houses and stuff like that, like people going in without inspections, like when you have that boom market, which has happened in Toronto a number of times, right? And it's just the feeling that these people even have, right? Like going in and you're right, like making the biggest purchase of your life, and you just have to make that decision on a whim and not even know if you're going to get it. And there's like, so many offers, like dozens of offers on that property, and that's the property that you want. It's so hard. And I even think like for the rental market, like that's how the rental market has become, right? Because I remember when I came and I wanted to get student housing, student housing is a really big deal right now, right? Because there's definitely not enough student housing. When I came, I mean, I literally arrived from Alberta. I had not even made the decision of where I was going to be living. I had contacted the school and been like, they actually gave me a number of options. They were like, okay, you can live over here or you can live over here. And I had a few different choices. I didn't even decide where I was going to live until a few weeks before school started. And I actually got like a 2-story like townhouse back then, like on campus, like across from Osgoode Hall. And I was able to live there, and it was like no problem. Like, you can stay here.
If I was going to look at your Twitter timeline from like those days, or your earliest real estate tweets, what would I have found?
So the earliest time, so when I really started getting into tweeting, because I had my account for a long time and I never really used it. And I guess when I started really using it was probably 2021. And part of my reason for actually even going on Twitter back then was what was going on with inclusionary zoning in the city. And that was sort of a hot topic back then, where they were saying that, every new build would include a certain number of affordable units. But those affordable units would basically be paid by people that were buying units in the building. And that concept sort of always bothered me. Like, I think like development fees in general and how we address development fees just as municipalities is a problem, because a lot of times the costs are put onto first-time home buyers in some capacity, or renters, because when you say inclusionary zoning and you add on like say $100,000 per unit or something like that, that cost has to be like someone has to bear that cost. And a lot of people would say, oh, well, it's just investors buying up those. So who cares if they have to pay $100,000?
Or city councilors would say that it comes out of the profits of the developers.
Yes. Ultimately, it does get passed on to either first-time home buyers or renters, because people, if they're spending $100,000 extra on their condo, they're going to expect the money to come from somewhere. And I think I got really passionate about that because I started realizing how zoning actually worked, and how a lot of the times it's always the first-time home buyers or newcomers that get affected by those costs, because they're the ones that kind of have to pay more money. And I think it was just a hot topic back then. Like, I mean, I think there was a lot of city councilors back then that were very pro inclusionary zoning, because it is something that sounds fantastic. It sounds really good. But when you look at cities who have tried to implement it without incentives, it doesn't work. And I think that was one of the problems that Toronto was seeing. Like, if you're not going to give incentives, if you're not going to give density bonuses, if you're not going to make it worthwhile, it's not going to work. And I guess it was just kind of the city's insistence on not giving incentives, which to me didn't make sense, because it's either you give incentives and get more units built, or you can't expect people to kind of bear that extra cost when development fees are already extremely expensive, even from like a Canadian standpoint. Like, Toronto has some of the highest development fees in the country. So.
And as someone who owned property and doesn't work in the real estate industry and isn't in planning, like, how did you get to the point where you started to really care about advocating for first-time home buyers?
Sure. So, I mean, I guess that was like a really hard one for me because, to begin with, like when I had got my property, and I almost had like a very old school way of thinking. Like I would say I was even like somewhat of a boomer type thinker, like a pull yourself up by the bootstraps. You're not working hard enough. Why don't you just get an extra job? What do you mean you can't afford it? Why don't you live in a studio to begin with? Like even to like young couples and stuff like that. Basically, you're just being very privileged and you're not like wanting to live in a studio. And I had a lot of judgments about that within myself. Like I think I think a lot of people who follow me today would not recognize my perspective back then. They'd be like, this is not her talking. But that is exactly how I felt. I really felt like you're not working hard enough. I did have a lot of compassion always. I mean, because I'm a social worker, I've always had compassion towards people who were like lower income, homeless populations, because those are populations I worked with. And I thought that's the real kind of housing crisis that's going on here. I don't know what everybody else is complaining about because that housing crisis is really only affecting a certain population. That was really where my mindset was. And I think that that's the mindset of a lot of resident groups in Toronto, a lot of people that say, I want affordable housing. I care about the homeless people. Like, I want something done for them, but they can't understand that the crisis has become a crisis for people who are middle class. And I think I had kind of like an awakening on that. I think there was a number of things that did change it. So for me, one of the things that did change it was more knowledge about the zoning process in general. I mean, when I learned about exclusionary zoning, and I learned that, on the yellow belt, which is 2/3 of the land, you could only build detached homes. And that was like very eye-opening for me. And then I think I was invited to go to one of those sessions that they have for new development when new development comes in, just to hear about some people talking at those sessions. Like I was like, what are they talking about? What do they mean? Why don't they want a new condo? I don't understand. And all the judgments that were in there. And the fact that the voices only reflected a loud minority of people. And they didn't include young people. They didn't include disabled people. They didn't include single moms. They didn't include young families, because who can dedicate 2 hours of their evening to go to this meeting? And I just sat there and I thought, you know what, how do people even do that? Like if you're working and you might even be working 2 jobs, how are you going to make that time? So whose voice is really at this table? And I think that really opened my eyes a lot, just to like development into what gets built and who decides what gets built and who decides what's affordable for people, right? Because the idea always was, well, affordable to whom? Why would you build it? Like no one can really afford to live in those condos. And then I think it was like that real estate boom that happened during the pandemic from like late 2020 to early 2022. And just seeing those prices skyrocket like crazy. And knowing a lot of young families and young people who worked very hard, did all the right things in their life and couldn't get into the market. And these people had been saving for years. They had their down payments. And they couldn't get in because it was like those bidding wars and lining up to see a house and only being able to go in there for 5 minutes and make a decision. And there was people that I knew that lost like bidding on like 30 homes and could not get a home. And I think that that's where I realized that there is a problem. And it's not just a problem that's affecting like lower class people. It's not just a problem that's affecting people in poverty. Like it's a problem that's even gone as far as affecting the middle class. And I also feel like in Canada, there is this diminishing middle class that we have. And I think another reason that I changed my perspective is just recognizing that when you have a diminishing middle class, it affects things like political stability. It can create problems with civil unrest. Like there's a lot of problems that come when you cause the middle class to diminish. So I guess that's sort of like how my perspective changed. So it was really like informing myself, and also being able to self-reflect on my own story, right? Like, hey, I was fortunate enough to get in early on. Not everybody has that privilege or luxury to get on early. Like they can't now, right? Mm-hmm. Like it's too late.
And social workers, like in my mind, are always like some of the most underpaid people in our society. There's a lot of people who aren't paid their worth, but social workers is definitely one of them. And I think about how, like, if you were able to, I don't think a social worker can buy a place on their own anymore. Like, at all. Like it's not even in the realm of possibility without, of course, if they have obviously if they have family help, they might be able to swing it. But other than that.
Yes. For sure. Like, I mean, the average paid social worker wouldn't be able to manage that. And it's like a lot of helping professions that you see that with now, right? Like with nurses, like back in the day, like a nurse could buy, property. I mean, I remember one of the first programs that I worked in Toronto. It was actually started out by a nurse who worked in one of the emergency rooms in a downtown hospital, and she purchased a home. She actually purchased a home. I think it's in Cabbagetown. Now I can't even remember where it's located, but she purchased this home with her money, and it was an emergency shelter she made for women. And you think about that story, like she purchased a home, like a mansion to do that with. That would never happen today. No. Like you could not do that on a nurse's salary. So
that's sad. I know that you talk a lot about landlords and tenants, and I know that you often show some, I guess, empathy for landlords in a space that isn't the most empathetic to landlords on Twitter. What made you get into kind of looking into the landlord side of it as well and defending kind of the plight of landlords right now?
Sure. So, I mean, I think like for the longest time, I have seen that there's two perspectives, right? Because there has been problems with the landlord tenant tribunal. Like there's been problems for a number of years, even before COVID started. So even before all these delays started at the board, like there has been cutbacks to the tribunals in Ontario. There's been like a cut in funding for them. I mean, recently they did hire more adjudicators. I also have had friends over the years who are investors in the market who do buy rental properties, and they're not bad people. Like they're not like the way that the media would portray them. They literally are just looking to invest their money somewhere. Some of them are looking for a retirement plan. Some of them are looking for a future property for their kid because they know that their kid is not going to be able to afford their property. And if they have the money, they're just putting it down to invest in. And I do always clarify that there is a difference between a person who's an investor and a speculator. I mean, speculators are known to sort of like distort the market, right? Like they can distort the market on the way up and they can do it on the way down. And I think like I did learn a lot about different kinds of landlord issues from the investors that I knew.
What's the difference between speculator and investor?
Sure. So for speculators are not really assessing their risk. They're not really having an exit plan if something goes wrong. Whereas a seasoned investor is going to know, like, this is my exit plan. If things go down under, I have a plan. I have savings. You know, if someone's not going to pay me my rent for a certain amount of time, they have a strategy that's there. Whereas a speculator is not assessing their risk and they're not even assessing the property. They're not really seeing, like, is it going to cash flow? Should I be looking at the like landlord tenant rules before I buy this? You know, there's people who bought properties, for example, that didn't even know that there's rent control on your building. And they think they can actually put up the rent. Like a speculator is not assessing for all of that. They're just saying, you know what? It's almost like a gambler. Like, I'm going to buy this, it's going to go up in price and I'm going to flip it. I'm going to sell it. Whereas I feel like a lot of investors are in it for the long term and they actually have a plan. They have enough savings to sustain themselves. So that's sort of, to me, like the difference. And I think because I did have a lot of friends that I knew that were investors and that did invest in the real estate market, kind of gave me like a different perspective that they're, for the most part, I think most tenants and most most landlords in Ontario are doing fine because most of them don't end up at the LTB.
The landlord tenant board.
Yeah, landlord tenant board. And I actually, like during the pandemic, just became an accidental landlord. Okay. I never set out to buy a rental. I never desired to buy a rental, but I was sort of stuck in my studio apartment and I had lived there for 10 years, basically, right? Like I was in this little tiny, like 400 square foot studio and I was getting sick and tired of it during the pandemic. I didn't have a balcony. It was very like isolating. I didn't find there was a lot of space for me. And I really wanted something different because I think like the pandemic just really affected me that way, where I think a lot of people wanted more space. So basically what happened was I decided that, you know, I couldn't sell my condo at that time because the condo market was actually depressed. So it wasn't a good time to sell my condo, but I had the ability to get another property and I did. So that's sort of how I accidentally became a landlord. And then I think I started kind of like just seeing like how, like, you know, for me, like, I think I had a conversation with a realtor before I, you know, rented my place out. And he gave me a lot of advice and he actually gave me this booklet, like, so how to actually treat your tenant. And it was like gold, because it was very much like, you're going to give your key to the tenant and it's their home now. It's not your home, and you're going to treat them that way. You're not going to, like, bother them or give them a rough time, and you're going to treat it as if you would want to be treated, right? So if they have a problem, you fix it. And it was just like all these really nice things in terms of how you interact with your tenant. It was almost like this guidebook, but it was a very compassionate one.
It'd be nice if everyone had that kind of thing, because there's a lot of stories out there of people, as you said, investing in properties and not really knowing the rules, don't understand, like they think that they can kick them out at any time. Like I hear horror stories all the time. And so the thought that there's like something out there that someone can use to learn the rules is like that. Everyone should look into that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. That was sort of like eye-opening for me, but it was also very good because I was able to, treat my tenant respectfully, and just do everything like by the rules and how you're supposed to do it. And it kind of like just taught me like how important it is to have that relationship with your tenant. Like you have to have a good relationship. Although I do think like being a landlord and landlording is a business, you do have to treat people properly, and just like people do in certain businesses, right? Like when you're offering customer service or you're doing something for someone, you don't treat them horribly. And I think like a lot of problems that end up at the landlord tenant bureau could probably be solved if people were following the rules, right? Like if people were doing things properly.
You were able to understand like the landlord side, but also seem to really understand the tenant side of it. What would you suggest that could change in order to get those two sides to kind of understand each other more and get along better to try to avoid the landlord-tenant board?
Well, I think both sides require education. Like, I do think that the tenants as well, like, I think the tenants are definitely like way more educated than the landlords. So
some of them,
I will give them that. Like they have that. But I do think that there's some misunderstanding there too with like what the rules are and the understanding that they have and like, how to communicate and stuff like that. Like that does, like, I see it sometimes on the tenant, like, forums and stuff like that, where someone will come and they'll ask a question. And I think because people dislike landlords so much, the answer is just stay there forever. It doesn't matter. The LTB is delayed, but that's even like staying there for the wrong reasons. Like when you know that it's not right, or just don't pay your rent, like just don't pay it. And I don't think that's really the proper solution, right? Like, yes, you could get away with not paying rent for years, but that's not the right way to handle a problem that's, come up just because, you're mad at the landlord and you're not going to pay your rent. Although I don't think that that's the way that it's made, like the way that some landlords make it sound like it's awful and tenants are not paying their rent. That's a very small minority that are not. I do think landlords require more education. Like I almost feel like they should have some sort of a course. And I don't know if it could be like a mandatory course, because I don't like the idea of that, because I don't think people necessarily like pay attention to that. But I do think like realtors are a point of contact for a lot of, landlords, where they can even have that role in terms of educating people. Because sometimes it's even, the person has said that, the realtor didn't tell me it's a rent controlled unit. And I think that's important to have as a conversation. And some realtors have that conversation. They say, look, if you're going to buy in this building, it's rent controlled. You cannot put up the rent unless it's by like, the standard guidelines or whatever. You're not putting it up for more than that. So I feel like that's sort of a point of contact where things could be better as well. And I think sometimes in the real estate business, what happens is that they also get so carried away with just selling the property that they forget to mention a lot of important details, right? I mean, even in terms of people that like sell a tenanted property, right? Like that comes with certain rules in terms of how you are going to evict that tenant. So I think there's just a lot of misunderstanding where some education would do a lot of people a lot of good.
There's a lot of people who kind of get really hurt when they sell their property that's tenanted, because I think that there's people who don't realize that they can't just account on the tenant leaving before the closing date. And they also, people buy it and don't realize it might be a while before they can kick out the tenant if they buy it tenanted. Like it's a risk when you're buying a tenanted property. And I guess that typically should be reflected in the price, but people don't want to admit that, it seems. I always think that the landlord tenant board, though, like there are so many bad actors on the tenant and on the landlord side. And just a functioning system would work. Like if they could just all follow the rules, and if there could be like some enforcement of the rules that already exist, like do we need to change the rules or just enforce the ones that are currently there?
So I feel like there's certain things that should be more enforced. Like, I mean, there's been a number of cases and some pretty like high profile ones where they've had a what they call a professional tenant, right? Who basically rents out a property and then will get into that property. Sometimes they do it with 5 properties at a time, like multiple properties. They re-rent it, they sublet it to multiple people. And some of these people that have been the professional tenants have actually been very bad actors, where they've re-rented it to very vulnerable populations and basically created very crowded, unsafe conditions for these people. And they're taking the rent from those tenants that they've rented it out to, but they're not paying the landlord either. So it's like you're making all this profit on all these homes. And there's been multiple cases of people doing this and taking over landlords' properties. And I do think that for bad actors like that, like when you're acting that badly and you're doing it repeatedly, the landlord tribunal needs to step in sooner, right? Like it can't be hundreds of thousands of dollars of damages to these families that just wanted a rental property. And it's not evil to want that as part of their like investment plan in their life. But then to say, well, it's a risk, the landlords deserve it. But that is somebody who's doing something wrong, okay? Like they're basically doing this to multiple homes, taking them over, and there's no recourse. Like they still have to wait for their LTB date, which could be 1.5 years down the road. Meanwhile, the landlord is losing their money every month. Fine. But then they're also having to pay for all these damages in the home. And it's still taking a long time. I mean, there was one case where this guy repeatedly did this for years. And I do think that a person who does that, there has to be deeper consequences, because in my perspective, what it's doing is it's making the entire environment more difficult for tenants. Because when they're looking for a property, right, the landlord is so picky. Oh, I need to see this. I need to see your bank statements. They're asking for all kinds of stuff that you're even like, why are you asking for it? But the reason they're asking is because they are so protective. And if they could trust a system, like if they could say, you know what, I'm going to get a date in the LTB within like, let's say even 6 months, they'd be happy. And I think that's reasonable. Within 6 months, you get a date over there. And some resolution happens within 6 months. They would be more willing to rent their property to more people.
I've always heard that tenants wait a lot longer than landlords wait. So any bad actors that are on the landlord side of it, like it can take a lot longer to resolve, if at all. And lots of tenants, I know so many people personally, so it's anecdotal, but I know this is a thing where, they know that they're being kicked out of their apartment in bad faith. However, they're like, I don't want to fight. I don't want to deal with it by living in an apartment where I know that the landlord wants to kick me out. Like, I just want to move on with my life and not have this stress. And it's hard because when obviously the cost of moving when you're in a rent controlled apartment is just like astronomical. You also have watched the international student conversation. And what are like some of the things that have happened to international students that you don't think have been getting enough attention?
Sure. So I mean, I think like a lot of focus is on the numbers, right? Like there's a lot of focus like, oh my God, there's this many international students that are here. And it's true, there are a lot, and they can cap the numbers and like, maybe that is the solution, to cap the numbers. But I don't think it fixes the problem. Like, I don't think that, saying like, okay, we're only going to let this many in, but there's so many problems behind that industry. I mean, the entire international student like recruitment process itself. I mean, Canada has never signed off on the London Agreement for the ethical, recruitment of these international students.
What is that?
So it's basically an agreement that was signed by a number of countries, except for Canada and the US are not included. But other countries have signed on. It's basically a promise that you're making that you're going to recruit students in an ethical manner. Because right now, the way that students are being recruited, it's not ethical, right? Like a lot of people, like kids coming here, they're given false promises. They're told when they come here, they're going to be registered at one school. By the time they come here, the agent is telling them, no, they have to register at another school. I mean, imagine like being new, flying across the world, leaving your entire family, being alone in this country, and then being told, oh, well, you're not going to that school. Or, there's been a few cases where they've ended up coming here and the school has said, like, we don't have any classes. Or you're coming here and all of a sudden they're like, oh, you're going to go to school online. So I think like that, it's just a measure of signing an agreement and agreeing. Like it just tells something about a country to just sign off and say, I agree with this. At least I acknowledge there should be an ethical recruitment process. So I think that's one issue. Now, I also feel like there's a lot of other issues that are not being addressed for these students. So there's been a lot of mental health issues for the students coming in. There's a lot of barriers to actually getting support. I mean, from a cultural perspective, there's a lot of stigma with mental health within certain cultures, right? Where it's hard to get help because that's not something that's really normal where they're coming from in terms of getting help for your mental health. So we have seen an increase in suicides with international students, where there's a funeral home in the GTA that reports it, has repeatedly reported in the media that they're sending back home 4 to 5, dead bodies of international students per month. And that's just one home. So there's a lot of issues there where they're saying that they can tell by the condition of the body that it has been a suicide, and in some cases it's a drug overdose. And it's a concern, right? And what are we going to do to address something like that? Like, I do think Canada has to start keeping track of the number of times that's happening. I also think that there's a labor market that's really exploiting these students through, LMIA frauds.
What's that?
So it's basically a labor market assessment that an employer has to do. And they have to basically say that, there's a need, like we've advertised this position this many times, and there's a labor market need for this position. It's $1,000 payment that the employer makes when they're putting in this application. It's not for a potential employee to have to pay that cost. But those market assessments, some employers are charging anywhere from $35,000 to $80,000 for them. Wow. And it is so bad, but people want, to get into Canada so bad that they're willing to pay that price. But what are we actually doing here, right? Like, knowing that this exists, the government has acknowledged that it exists, but are we going to change anything? So I'd like to see more changes in how to make an actual more positive experience for students, because it's something that there's all these issues that are going on within these international students that are not being discussed, right? It all becomes about, we just need to cut the numbers down. Sure, cut the numbers down, but what's going to happen to the actual lived experiences of these students? Because we don't want people, to end up coming here, spending all of this money and being set up to fail. That's not.
How do you know all this? Like, where are you hearing about the personal experience?
It's so interesting because so some of it is just international students who have talked to me, but a lot of stories actually come out of the cultural community. So that they actually have their own media sources where they have like TikTok channels and they have YouTube channels and they have radio shows. So what's been interesting to me about like the whole international student coming into the mainstream media is it's actually something that a lot of those communities have been talking about for years. Like, they've been talking about these issues and talking about the living conditions and all these different things and highlighting it even in some of their reports and stuff like that. But it's just something that hasn't really been a mainstream issue until more recently, like in recent times, right? But it's something that's been heavily discussed within those, communities. And I do wish like there was more room for engagement with those students and with those communities to just come up with an actual solution, because a lot of people are into let's just cap all the students, but there's a problem with that too, right? Because domestic students, do domestic students want to pay more? And does the government want to provide more funding? I think it's going to be a deeper discussion. Something needs to happen, but I think that there's so many layers of that issue, and there's so many, there's so much failures that's happened with the government, but also with universities and colleges themselves. I mean, I look at, sometimes I'll just take a drone picture of the university, for example, a university, and you see how much land they have and buildings that are very low density. I don't see any reason why they can't upzone that and build student housing. What would they need to make that happen, right? What would incentivize them to build more housing and take more responsibility? Because there's schools Cape Breton University that have 70% of their student population now is international students, but they don't have the housing, right? And they basically say that previous to this cap, they said they wanted to take more international students.
Yeah, if Mike was here, he would say he always wants to remind people that it's the international students who are being hurt the most by this. Yes, it's distorting the housing market. Yes, it's a big problem, and on a macro level for sure. But the people who are the worst victims of this are the international students themselves.
Absolutely. And that's where I think that there has to be more, attention paid, and to create that positive experience, and to not make it about like, oh, they're the problem and to blame, like, because that's where I think the conversation sometimes ends up going, and it's very problematic because I see that sometimes when I post a story and I get all these hateful comments towards these students who did nothing more than wanted to come to a different country to have a better life. And I think that if any of us were in the situation that some of them are in their home countries, because that's another consideration I always have, is that they're coming here because they don't have the opportunities that they want to have in life where they are right now. And we all would have made the same decision if we were them. Like, we'd say, you know what, we want to go to that country. It seems like we'd have better opportunities. And there's also a lot of success stories that come out of, tons of them that come out of international students. So.
Yeah, I see it online, people talking about how they need to come, they know they're going to come here if they do their research, they know they're going to end up sharing a tiny basement apartment, probably maybe an illegal apartment with 6 other people or more. I know that there's lots of stories of 12, 15 people sharing places. And it's like, I guess I often have read that people will see it as, this is just a temporary situation. You'll get there. You'll live like that for a bit. It's going to be not ideal, but then you're going to be able to have that diploma, usually a diploma or a degree, and be able to start a new life somewhere. And it's like, it's so sad when it doesn't, when that's not the reality for them. I can't imagine coming here and realizing like maybe you're not actually enrolled in the school that you thought you were enrolled in.
Yeah, exactly. And those are the things that I think need to change. And I think that schools that are repeatedly bad actors and repeatedly engaging in that, should they exist, right? Like, if you're going to do that multiple times to students, maybe you shouldn't actually have like a license to operate that school, right? Because you're obviously not there to provide a positive experience for those international students.
I know here on The Missing Middle, we like to ask about solutions, since that's always something that's missing from a lot of other places. So what would be like your top solution if you wanted to try to fix things?
So my top solution is actually, like, I think that zoning is still a problem. Like, I think despite the fact that there's a lot of changes, with zoning, I think zoning, red tape, just the ability to build housing fast enough. I mean, I get it, like, that there's a shortage of construction workers. I do think that immigration stream needs to be considered more in terms of how do we make it easier for people to actually be construction workers when they're coming to Canada. Because one of the comments I've gotten from multiple people who have come here as newcomers have said it's very difficult for them to even get into the certain trades. How do we make that different? And how do we even change that from a Canadian perspective, like in terms of the stigma that people face in terms of going into the trades? How do we make that more desirable for people? Because people can get very well paid in the trades, but there's that stigma that still exists. And I think, like, in terms of zoning, like, how do we make it possible to get more housing near campuses and on campuses? Like, how do we get, like, my ideal solution is huge towers. I mean, people don't always like towers because of the shade and all these different reasons, but I believe that we need to get people out of the basements. I mean, basements serve a purpose, but we can't have 25 people living in one basement. Like, it's just not safe. It's a fire trap. There's issues with that. So I would say, like, look at actually building housing. And I think it's not just an issue with the international students, right? Like, that's just it across the country, really. It's becoming that way because, that solution of just move doesn't work, because you can move and you're still going to face the same crisis. And we're just, exporting our crisis across Canada at this point. So,
yeah.
I think, building enough housing and matching that to population growth, which we haven't been doing, right? Like, that's a serious problem. And the fault lies on the government. And I always tell people this, because I think often people say, oh, it's the immigrants, or, it's this group, or it's foreign buyers. No, it's our government. Like, our government has failed. The housing policies have failed. We need them to take a proper action to get appropriate levels of housing built. And that's both, like, market rate housing and deeply affordable housing.
Thanks so much for joining us and putting a face behind the Twitter avatar. It's really good of you to take the time.
Thank you so much.
And thanks to everyone for watching and listening. And thank you, as always, to our incredible producer, Meredith Martin. Please like, subscribe, comment. It always is lovely to hear from you. And we'll see you next time.